The Texans welcome the Jaguars to NRG for a get-right game. We're going to talk about all that and more on this edition of The Bullpen.
To throw the punches away. He floats one wide open, and there he goes. Tagged down for a Texan touchdown.
Hello and welcome to The Bullpen. As always, I'm James Roy, and with me is Tom Chavarria. Tom, how are you doing today?
Man, I'm looking forward to a new week, a new hope. Last week's football game was really discouraging for a lot. I mean, I told some people, like, look, if you don't think this team can right the ship, well then I don't know what to tell you. You might as well start watching the Rockets, because it's way too early in the season to all of a sudden act like they don't have the pieces or the talent to go far in the playoffs or win the division or make a legit run at the ultimate prize. So this is a good get right spot, I think. Back home cooking, pretty excited.
I'm excited for it too. You said a new hope, and I was like,
yeah,
I'm ready for it. I'm ready for this game. I'm ready for a true Jedi duel between, Trevor Lawrence and CJ Stroud. If only the Jaguars were a worthy opponent. I don't want to trash the Jaguars too much. I don't want to put a jinx on it. I just had to get my dig in there. But yeah, as always, this is The Bullpen. You're listening, so you know it's a Texans podcast. If you are listening and you want to watch, you can watch it on YouTube. The handle is at The Bullpen Cast. And if you would like to listen and you're watching, find us wherever you get your podcasts at. Just search up The Bullpen, a Houston Texans podcast, and we will pop up. Tom, how do you feel going into this game against the Jaguars? Another divisional matchup, second one of the season, going back to home. First game wearing the home uniforms. We've worn the away uniforms 3 games in a row. How are you feeling?
I'm looking forward to it. I think this is a spot where, there were some egos that were bruised a little bit. This game against the Vikings really kind of, put the spotlight on a team that, up until that point had been told they were one of the best teams in football, one of the top, handful of teams that could compete for a Super Bowl, and they had just been receiving all the praise. And now they're coming off of a game where they got some criticism for not playing up to the level. I think they were fortunate to get through the Bears and make some mistakes and still get the win. But the Vikings absolutely served them a slice of humble pie, and now they can refocus, relock in, and take out their frustrations on a familiar foe.
Yeah, 100%. Last time the Texans played the Jaguars for the first matchup of the season was in Jacksonville, first off, but that was the emergence of Tank Dell. That was really, I would say, the emergence of CJ Stroud was that game. Because to that point, I think a lot of people had in their heads confirmed this narrative about the Texans that they weren't going to be any good. And that obviously was proven to be wrong through this matchup. Are there any particular players on Jacksonville's defense that you're looking out for based off what we saw last week? Anything you think the Jaguars are going to pick up from Brian Flores that could probably slow CJ Stroud and the Texans offense down?
I'll be interested to see how the offensive line responds to probably one of the worst games they've played in 2 years, maybe. And, if I'm the defense for the Jacksonville Jaguars, I would go and watch that tape heavy and see, what I can find as to how to maneuver your edge rushers, your pass rushers, to get the pressure that, Minnesota was able to get. Because as we spoke to in our last show, Jonathan Grenard lived in the backfield. I think that the run game really suffered this past game. We felt, a lot of the Texans fans felt that Cam Akers could shine. And Minnesota didn't want to have anything to do with that. They really shut the running game down and made the Texans really one-dimensional. And if I'm Jacksonville, I'm trying to recreate that recipe that Minnesota had. I just don't think any team can do that. I really think Minnesota is potentially one of the best teams in the NFC and really could be, one of the last teams standing, talking about Super Bowl type stuff based on what they showed so far through 3 games.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that the Lions maybe put an end to the Vikings, or maybe it's like some kind of Linsanity run, but specifically defensively, that's a team that's really tough to play. And with what they've been able to put together, and Kevin O'Connell's a really good offensive play caller. That's just a team that's really scary. And the Jaguars aren't quite that. I mean, Doug Peterson, there's already Jags fans calling for his job. They've just not really had a good go of it this season, especially being viewed widely as one of the teams that's in contention for the AFC South. Depending on who you ask, it's the Texans, Jaguars, or Colts if you're going into the season. And I think the Colts have, even though they beat the Bears, have kind of played themselves out, at least early on, of contention based off of the way that Anthony Richardson's looked on the field. So looking at the Jaguars, though, I think defensively they should definitely try and look at what Brian Flores was able to do, but I'm not sure they have the talent on the defensive side of the ball to replicate that. But I'm interested to see that because much like I talked about at the beginning of this week in the recap, a lot of the problems the Texans had centered around Bobby Slowick, demanding these long developing plays and the Minnesota pass rush getting there before those plays could develop. And so looking back to last season, that was a lot of what the Texans did. Some of their better plays against the Jaguars early on were long developing plays where the O-line, which was patchwork, I remember there was a lot of injuries, was able to hold up long enough for the Texans to be able to put together these long developing plays that resulted in deep balls. And also, Stroud's ability to get out of the pocket and be a little mobile it didn't hurt last time that the Texans played to start the season against the Jaguars. But I'm hopeful that we get a better matchup than we did last year in NRG with that 24-21 game where it felt like the refs were kind of out to get the Texans. And so, looking at the Jaguars defense, there's not anything specifically that jumps off the page and tells me, hey, this could be what stops the Texans. But that being said, the Texans have a history of playing down to their opponents. So I'm not going to say that the Jaguars defense is, a non-factor. But looking at this from the Texans side of the ball, offensively, we'll look at C.J. Stroud, who's looking to get back 2 picks, 168 yards, I believe, passing last week. What do you think are some of the keys to getting C.J. Stroud going against this Jaguars team?
I really feel like for me, it's just really trying to find, more balance from the run game. Obviously, we fall in love with what CJ can do, and he's elite. There's no question. But I think if you look at all the best teams, they're able to at least represent with their quarterbacks. They're at least able to represent a decent run game to keep you honest enough to have a quarterback to take advantage of, a difference in the secondary. And I think in the last game, you really looked at CJ really having a hard time dealing with obvious passing downs more often than not. So for me, I think the best recipe to get CJ right is to really try to establish the run a little bit more. I think, also trying to use Tank. Obviously, we don't know the severity of his injury. He got a little nicked up towards the end of the game. But I think being able to use Tank around the line of scrimmage, some quick hitting plays, stuff like that. If the run game is going to struggle, then maybe pass out of the backfield or, hit Stephon on these shorter routes. Use the tight ends a little more so that you're not depending on CJ to try to go out and hunt down Nico Collins down the field or have a route that develops so long that you're asking this offensive line who's really had a hard time in pass pro protect for as long as they need him to protect.
Yeah, and a lot of this Texans offense revolves around those explosive plays, like getting Nico deep and that stuff. But the requisite work was not put in last week to set those up. So it was right out the gate, we want these plays to be long developing and try and send the ball deep. But we haven't put in any of the groundwork to set this offense up to do that. So I would anticipate, obviously, if Joe Mixon's back, that's huge because that would put the Texans in a position to get the run game established. Another thing that I'd look at is if if they are struggling early on to form a pocket, maybe move the pocket, roll CJ out, get him in space where he has time to let the play develop, or where he has time to at least make an informed decision before he decides to launch the ball out of the backfield. Because it felt like CJ was constantly dropping back into turmoil, and nothing was being done to give him the time he needed to get the ball out of there. So, I mean, like I said, the Jaguars defense is not my biggest concern. I think my biggest concern is Bobby Slowick's response. I think back to the I don't know if you ever saw the Rocky Balboa movie. If you want to feel old, that was the first one that I saw. I didn't see the other 5 movies until after I saw that one. But there's that speech, which was really the only great moment in that movie, I felt like, where he's like, it's not about how hard you can hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep going. That's how winning's done. And so, like, that's what I think about is, like, right now the Texans are in that state where they got punched in the freaking face and they need to, like, figure out how to respond. And so I'm not concerned with the Jaguars here. This is the get back game. It's about how the Texans set up their game plan to be able to get back. So that's what I'm interested in seeing. And specifically, you called out the offensive line. That is going to be a huge thing. Do you think that in practice this week, maybe, I don't know, maybe the offensive line looks at making some adjustments, or do you think maybe you run it back with the same group? This is a group that last season everyone was like, well, we're just not healthy, and that's why it's not working. And now we've gotten a couple games with the offensive line fully healthy, and it's probably my biggest concern going into any game right now. What are your thoughts?
I don't know, but I would hope that if nothing else, they just rotate a couple guys in. I'd obviously like to see Kendrick Green if we could see him. I'd obviously like to see Derek Fisher. Is that? Do I get my
Blake
Fisher? Blake Fisher. There it is. Derek Fisher's the basketball player. Blake Fisher. I'd like to see him play more. I feel like if for nothing else than to just give some of these guys a break. And obviously, offensive line play, I think, matters more, on the road than it does at home. I think they're going to play better because they're at home. The thing out of the last game was that, it was a loud environment, and it was. Credit to the Minnesota fans. They showed up. They made it really difficult on the offensive line. They spoke to communication issues, but I would also feel like, just giving some of these guys a chance to rotate in and out, maybe that'll help. And CJ spoke to it in his post game presser. He did not feel like this was the time to point fingers. This was a humbling moment. I'm glad it happened in the beginning of the season, so we can take a step back, reflect, and figure out the corrections we need to make, and then be a good football team going forward. And if you think that Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard and Kenyon Green and Shaq Mason aren't the answer at offensive line, well, then you really have a problem through your entire season, because those guys are heavily paid and they're depended on to be the guys. There's nobody walking through the door that's going to just replace a Pro Bowl caliber left or right tackle.
Yeah, and someone outlined it right, but the least assets that the Texans have invested in the offensive line is a second-round pick in Juice Scruggs. Like, they have a first-round pick invested in Kenyon Green, and every other player on that offensive line is making, upwards of $10+ million a year to play where they're at. So you can't just move on from that suddenly because of one game. If there's a trend throughout the season of, hey, this is about investment and we need to do something to win games, where this is what's getting in the way, I could see Blake Fisher taking on one of the tackle roles if it's deemed that one of those guys is not the best option. But and I'll own it. I mean, during halftime, I was like, put Blake Fisher in instead of Laramie Tunsil, if you have to, because these pre-snap penalties are killing us. But to that effect, obviously Laramie Tunsil is an elite left tackle, and you have to kind of take him for what he is and be prepared for that one false start. It just seemed like every single one of them happened at the worst possible time. It was a Murphy's Law game, I'll call that. And for those of you who aren't entirely nerds out there like I am, Murphy's Law states that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And so the Texans had their Murphy's Law game, and it's time to to move on and disregard that law that is existing in some place in science and move on. So with that, I think that the offensive line should have their get back. I agree with you that playing at home is certainly better for them than any other environment. But moving into the defensive side of things, obviously not their best work. Do you think that this is a prime matchup for a get back in terms of pass rushing?
I hope so. I really feel like so far the Jags have really struggled, and I think that they're 0-2 for a reason. And I think for the Texans to be able to create turnovers and get to Trevor Lawrence, it's going to be really big. I really feel like for me, they're going to play better at home too. Just sleep in their own bed, home cooking, that sort of thing. So I'm looking forward to them really trying to really reestablish, the Houston Texans as a really good football team. And you're probably going to get your best game out of some of these guys just because, of how bad the last game went. This will be their ability to respond. I think D'Amico is going to call for them all to respond. You're probably going to see D'Amico play call a little differently. He's probably going to be able to take advantage of some situations, be more aggressive, where I think, if I'm being honest, in the Minnesota game, I think some of the defenses were kind of vanilla. And, I think that kind of hurt the Texans a little bit, not being able to get home and really cause some havoc. So I'm really hoping that we see something that looks more like the Chicago game and less like the Minnesota game.
Yeah, and if you thought poorly of Sam Darnold at any point, and you're a Texans fan, you probably also think poorly of Trevor Lawrence. And I think that the importance of being able to apply that pressure to him. Lawrence is a quarterback who can, when there's no pressure and the temperature is right and all conditions are in favor of him being good, will put a game on you. But if you can apply pressure to Trevor Lawrence, I believe that that's the key to just absolutely causing havoc in that Jaguars offense. But defensively, do you think there's reason to be concerned for the secondary if the pass rush is similar to the Minnesota game, like maybe gets home a couple times but isn't consistently applying pressure?
Absolutely. There's definitely weapons on the Jacksonville Jaguars team that can go out and have similar games that Justin Jefferson did. You look up and down their roster. They do have guys that have had some ceiling games in the past. And, like we spoke to, Trevor Lawrence is thought of as a really good quarterback. He was drafted incredibly high. And if he's allowed to sit back and read and scan and go through his progressions, yeah, he can make plays too. We've seen that too. I just think, for me personally, when you look at a team that got pretty thoroughly embarrassed like the Texans did, I think there's going to be added motivation to really send a message that, hey, it was just a bad game, and this is not who we are. There's going to be a real emphasis, I think, this week in practice and stuff like that, to really make sure that they leave no doubt that they're the class of the AFC South.
I agree. I think that obviously we've talked about the connection between the pass rush and the secondary, but this is a secondary that's capable of playing. Maybe there's some scheme adjustments that could be made. When I look at the Jaguars receiving core, Brian Thomas Jr. is a guy who I really wanted the Texans to draft, even though the Texans already had plenty at wide receiver because of how talented he is, and he has shown up in a way for the Jaguars that can't be denied. Christian Kirk and Gabe Davis don't necessarily scare me in that same way. But I mean, to say that they don't have any receivers would be a disservice to what they have. But to say that they have elite receivers would be overstating it. They're somewhere in the middle. They've got a serviceable receiving core that can get you if you underestimate it. And I think that the Texans have the talent to step up and play them well. I think this is a game we talked about it earlier in the week, where that felt like the Texans' game plan defensively was just line up and play football and kind of disregard. And I feel like if you do that against this Jaguars team, it won't be the end of the world. But I would be keeping an eye on Brian Thomas Jr. for sure, to make sure that he doesn't burn this secondary. And that's another LSU guy. And Jefferson's an LSU guy. Those LSU corners and receivers just make each other better. And so, yeah, I obviously have some reason to be concerned with him, but I think the Texans should be set as long as they, play their game here. Like, this is the kind of game where they can do that. But obviously, as I've said in the past, this is a divisional game. Could go either way in my head. Like, as much as I like to think talent-wise the Texans could sweep the division, I'm not going to like chalk it up to just, show up and win. It's not a free win. Nothing is. But looking at the running back room for the Jaguars, you've got ETN. He hasn't exactly lit the world on fire this year, but I'd still it's someone that could challenge this run defense that has shown to be pretty good over the last year or so. Aaron Jones put up 105 yards rushing on this defense last week. And in the past, Jonathan Taylor has lit it up. Didn't quite do that at the beginning of this season. What do you think there is to say when it comes to the Jaguars' run game?
It can get it done. They're between Etienne and I think his name is Tank Billingsley. I think or Bigsby. Bigsby. There it is. They can definitely hit you in the mouth. Etienne, I think he's really good. In the pass game. Which, if I'm being honest, I think the Texans did a good job against Aaron Jones because they didn't have to. If the game was more in question, I think you would have got a bigger game from Aaron Jones. So if I'm circling players on Jacksonville, Etienne's at the top of my list. They have to figure out a way to contain him, and then from there you can kind of branch out to the different wide receivers in the room, and then be able to look at it that way. For me, he's probably priority one. And then just being able to have the other team playing in down and distance where I felt like Minnesota was 2nd and 1, 2nd and 2, 2nd and 3, like all game long.
Yeah, no, I mean, to me personally, if you've got a good running back, it's a concern for me, and ETN is that. So I will always respect the run game and say the Texans need it, because if the run game gets going, it creates this conundrum of how you align the defense in order to stop the run or the pass. It could create a scheme issue, if you will, in terms of the defensive game plan. So obviously a priority. Last thing we'll look at with the Jaguars offense and how we feel about it is the tight end room. Evan Ingram has missed the first couple weeks this season with injury. What do you think it would mean to them to have him back for the Texans game?
I mean, it's a concern. He's definitely a talented tight end. I think when Jacksonville went out and got him, it was to improve, to have another weapon. And I think he's definitely somebody that you have to account for. Do I think he's like Dalton Schultz? No. Do I think he's still pretty good? Yes, I do. So I don't know what his status will be. I know that they've had a backup guy that's, been able to do a few things for them, put up a couple of decent games. So it's just really going to be important that whatever the situation, whatever, defensive alignment they decide to throw at Jacksonville, that they definitely account for the tight end, because Trevor Lawrence definitely is not afraid to use them as a resource.
100%, 100%. Now with that, we will move into the prediction elements of this game, or this episode, sorry. And Tom, I want to start with you. What are your thoughts on the final score of this matchup?
So I really am concerned with the secondary. I think you've seen them so far have some games where they just don't look as good as we thought they would coming into the season. I'm not going to put it on, the corners. I'm not going to put it on the safety. I'm going to put them on as a unit as a whole. When they play zone, I don't necessarily feel great about when they play zone. I don't, I know what PFF says about Kamari and Derek, but do I feel like there are plays that they get beat? I do. It's impossible for them not to. So I really just hope they're not big chunk plays, explosives. But as far as the actual score of the game goes, give me 27-14 Houston.
I like that prediction. I think that's solid. I think that the Texans I'd give Jacksonville 2 touchdowns. I mean, I think that's fair. And I think the Texans should, obviously, if they can get right, be able to, put up an offensive show. And, for the most part, it sounds obvious, but the way it's described is, as a defense, ideally you allow less than 20 points. As an offense, ideally you score more than 20. So for me, that's the baseline for each side of the ball is 20 points and being over or under it. And so I think that's a solid performance. If I'm giving my score prediction, I might go a little closer. I'll go 27-20. I'm going to give Jacksonville 2 field goals and make it a little close towards the end for the sake of the storybook ending. Obviously, no other ulterior motives there. And with that, we'll get into the storybook ending. Tank Dell played a huge role in the first game that Jaguars played against the Texans last year. So with this, we'll put the Texans in a 2-minute drill, tied at 20. This is a situation where you're like, James, why is the final score 27-20 if the Texans are in 2-minute drill and they're tied at 20? Because why didn't they take the field goal? It's like, well, they didn't mean to do it this way. They just did. And it creates a little more drama. Early on in that drive, they kind of move it, but they do it. It's one of those things where they score maybe a little too quickly. They're like, oh, the Texans have a 2-minute drill. They could run the clock, kick a field goal, and get out of there. And with 1 minute and 20 seconds left, CJ hits Tank Dell on a little outside go, skinny post kind of thing going on. And Tank takes it to the house. And then the Texans obviously kick the extra point. And Trevor Lawrence comes out and just has the most awful, absolutely no good drive ever and can't get the Jaguars rolling. And the Texans get the ball back, knee it out, and the game is over. Not my most exciting storybook ending, I guess. You don't like it when I do them because you don't like the stress of it, but I mean, I don't know. I feel like that one was pretty okay. What are your thoughts?
I hope you're 100% wrong, as usual. I don't necessarily want this game to be in question with 2 minutes left to go. I hope that it's salted away early and often, being up by 17 late in the game. If I'm giving a ending, it won't be storybook for anybody. Maybe for the Texans, I guess, the team's storybook ending, they're up 17 and, they're up 13 and, Jacksonville's just trying to do whatever they can, score fast, and defense does their job. Trevor Lawrence running for his life. He throws the ball up, and there's Kalen Bullock. He picks it off. That's one of those things where, catches the ball and takes a knee, then they run the clock out. I really hope that this is a performance where we're looking at it and go, the game was never in question. Texans were thoroughly in control throughout. And, maybe they score a touchdown, kind of like Dallas did last week where they scored some points late, to make it kind of entertaining. But, the Texans had a really sizable lead and, they were just able to impose their will on a Jacksonville Jaguars team that's just not in the same level.
Yeah, I feel you on that. Another way to write it would be to drop a field goal off of it or maybe rearrange the storybook ending to where the Jaguars are the ones in 2-minute drill 27-17 and they settle for a field goal and then the Texans go 4 and out and the Texans run the clock out the rest of the way, but that was less exciting. I don't know. It's the game was never in doubt. The Texans, never really sweated it, but still, I don't know. I like for it to be kind of, more dramatic. That's what I'm going for with these storybook endings. But yeah, any last thoughts on this matchup before we kind of bring this thing to a close, Tom?
I think that everybody needs to take a collective breath. Hopefully after this game, we're talking about a team that's 3-1 up there with the elites of the entire league, AFC. I mean, look, nobody, including myself, thought that the Texans were going to go 17-0. So you really had to understand that there was going to be losses in the season. And the Minnesota loss was very ugly. Obviously, you would like them to lose gracefully, I guess. be in every game. But the fact of the matter is that this is a moment for them to learn, go into this Jacksonville game and really impose their will. That's really what I want to see from this game more than anything. I want the Texans to absolutely leave no doubt at the end that there are two different classes in the AFC South, and they're elite and Jacksonville is not. And I think anything less than that will be a cause for concern because, that does make me think that there is a level that the Texans still have to get to in order to really be considered with Kansas City and Baltimore and Miami and maybe Buffalo and to the way people are talking, the Jets, they had a really good game 2 weeks ago or on Thursday night. So obviously their opponent wasn't very good, but you really want to be considered with those elites. And to do that, you have to really establish, and some of these games, like, look, they're just better.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And especially with the Bills knocking on the door to go into Houston, you're debuting I can only assume, I'm pretty sure they've announced that they're debuting the H-Town Color Rush uniforms during that matchup. And so another Diggs revenge game shortly after one that didn't go very well. I'm looking squarely at Bobby Slowick's game plan. And like I said before, D'Amico Ryan's less so because he's kind of, if he lines up and does what he did last week against Minnesota, I don't think the Jaguars are going to be able to take quite as much of an advantage of it as the Vikings did. Whereas Bobby Slowick's game plan, I think, if it doesn't go well, could put the Texans in a tight matchup again. And at that point, I've expressed I'm not super concerned with Bobby Slowick per se, but you start, as things happen like what happened last week, you start to kind of be more observant of, okay, so how do you respond when that kind of thing happens to your offense? Can you make adjustments? Are you adaptable, or are you just going to keep calling the offense the exact same way that you always do? Because then that goes into the discussion that other teams are having around the discussion was always, CJ will have a sophomore slump because other teams have film on him. And the only reason that would have been applicable is if the film on him is 100% applicable because the Texans are just going to run the exact same offense regardless and never adjust and never give CJ the ability to shine outside of this one single dimensional offensive scheme. And so that's what I'm keeping my eyes on going into this week. Thank you for tuning into the Bullpen. You can find us at the Bullpencast on Instagram and on Twitter. Also, that's the @ for the YouTube channel. If you would like to follow Tom and I am at James Roy NFL on Twitter and at N1 Texans fan on Instagram. Tom is at Third Coast Tom on Twitter and at TC Tom1 on Instagram. Thank you for watching the show. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts if you want to listen, and if you would like to watch, like I said, the YouTube channel. Stay classy, Houston, and vamos Texans. Thanks for tuning into The Bullpen, a Texans podcast. Please like, comment, subscribe, and follow along for more Texans talk from The Bullpen.
Take the handoff. Stroud looking. Stroud